The rise of the RPG genre is a genuinely fascinating facet of gaming where both the East and West influence one another in far different ways. And while the genre took a while to become the powerhouse that it is today, there were notable releases along the way, signifying its continual growth. Believe it or not, both Japan and the West were influenced by the same two games, Ultima and Wizardry. But although Japan emulated those games on PC for a number of years, it was a release of Dragon Quest that marked a division in Western RPGs and JRPGs, although that distinction is misguided these days. RPGs are RPGs, there are just several flavors to enjoy. Either way, Dragon Quest popularized RPGs on consoles, which evolved over time to include greats like Chrono Trigger, Tactics Ogre, Lufia, Phantasy Star, and so many more. But while the genre was popular enough to support a modest fanbase, it didn't truly break out until the release of Final Fantasy VII. It is difficult to express just how much of a shift this game was for the general public. In America, the game was released in September of 1997, 2 years into the lifespan of the PS1, and by this point, only the original Toy Story had ever been released by Pixar. So to see commercials of this wild, action-packed game filled with cutscenes that at least seemed comparable at the time, and on a console no less, was mind-blowing. It didn't hurt that the game was good too, maybe too simple for hardcore RPG enthusiasts at the time, but it brought in new fans and, certainly in my case, a hunger for other RPGs like this. But what about the PS1 RPGs released before Final Fantasy VII? What did they offer and how did they take advantage of Sony's new console? Well, I thought it'd be fun to take a quick look at the 16 RPGs that came out before 7's January 31st, 1997 Japanese release. I'm also keeping it to just the Japanese side of things to keep it simple. So what was the first PS1 RPG? Well, that would be Kingsfield, released 13 days after the PS1's launch and developed by a company you may have heard of, From Software. In fact, this was their very first game. Kingsfield is a first-person dungeon crawler where the player is searching for the source of invading monsters in order to put a stop to their attack. This involves navigating 5 levels of a huge dungeon, which was entirely rendered in 3D. The usual search for maps to explore, equipment to upgrade, and items to find were all there, but what made it stand out was the stamina bar, which dictated how often the player could attack and use magic. This, along with its high difficulty, left many at the time polarized as to the quality of the game, but good word of mouth eventually spread, leading to its eventual success. Funny, that's how Demon's Souls began for the company. Fitting when From Software has stated that the Souls series is considered a spiritual successor to Kingsfield. It would be another 6 months before the next RPG would be released, Ark the Lad, a strategy RPG developed by G-Craft, who had developed the original Front Mission on the Super Famicom. In fact, Sony had specifically asked them to create the game as they wanted to expand the available RPGs on the PlayStation and suitably served as their publisher. The game itself played like many other strategy RPGs of the era, though from a top-down perspective rather than isometric. Graphics were kept to squat 2D sprites, though the various spells used the PS1's 3D capabilities. And Ark the Lad would be a massive hit, becoming not only the 9th best-selling game across all consoles in Japan for 1995, but the best-selling PS1 game period in the region. Yet despite a localization campaign from dedicated RPG players in the West, Sony opted not to bring it over until a collection of the series was eventually released on the PlayStation 2. Incredibly, the third RPG for the PS1 was Kingsfield II, released in July of 1995. This time, the player must explore the dungeons of a mysterious island in order to find the Holy Moonlight Sword for their kingdom. The gameplay remained mostly the same, except with improved graphics. It also actually got a Western release, though it was localized as Kingsfield I. Really, the biggest issue critics had was the slow pace your character walked, making exploration drag somewhat. But the action RPG mechanics shined through, and it still saw great reviews across the board. The PS1 would see its next RPG with Sen Goku Cyber, Fujimaru Jikokuhen, a strategy game released in late October 1995. Players take the role of a village of ninjas who must take jobs and build up their clan during the Sen Goku period of Japan. This includes developing weapons, increasing production, and the like. While the idea of running your own ninja village sounds interesting, the game is painfully slow, despite its colorful cast. Sen Goku Cyber seems mostly forgotten as there's little information on it from importers, and even less on YouTube, so it's little wonder it was never localized. Only a week later, Beyond the Beyond was released, marking not only the first traditional RPG on the PS1, but the first non-Shining game developed by Camelot. You know, the ones who would go on to develop Mario Golf, Mario Tennis, and Golden Sun. The story centers on a planet nearly destroyed by two warring factions before a treaty was created. This treaty allowed the world to flourish for hundreds of years, but now an evil force has broken it. It's up to a young man named Finn to discover the villain behind it all and restore peace before war breaks out once again. Sadly, the game was lambasted for how generic it all felt. From the battle system to the graphics to the story, nothing stood out as a next-generation RPG. Its most notable feature was a timing element akin to Super Mario RPG that allowed players to deal or defend more damage. But nowadays, it's mostly considered a footnote in Camelot's legacy. But 1995 would end strongly with the release of Konami's Suikoden. What many consider to be a landmark title in the lead-up to Final Fantasy VII's release, Suikoden has the player take the role of the son of a general in the Scarlet Moon Empire. He is tasked to find 108 people, known as the 108 Stars of Destiny, in order to rout out the corruption within the Empire and stop an endless cycle of war. And 108 is indeed correct, as all of them can be recruited throughout the game, though there are some that aren't fighters. The battle system has the player control up to 6 characters at once, with special care taken to the spacing of their placement, as weapon range is paramount to success in battle. And since each character has only one weapon, it becomes all the more important. There are even 2 types of battles, Standard and War, though they share some mechanics. Although the critics found the graphics to be a little underwhelming and the difficulty easy, many agreed that its strong and unique story, user-friendly battle system, and incredible soundtrack made it one of the early greats on the PlayStation. Before moving on to 1996, 95 also saw the release of Wizardry VII, Crusaders of the Dark Savant, at some point. The original Wizardry VII was released on DOS in 1992 and would later get an upgraded version known as Wizardry Gold for Windows. However, this was not the version released exclusively in Japan for the PS1. The PS1 release was brand new and included convenient auto-mapping, easier character creation, and dialogue choices rather than needing to type in questions. Many consider it an excellent update even beyond Wizardry Gold, though it's only available in Japanese. The first RPG of 1996 wouldn't arrive until late June and would mark the third Kingsfield game in as many years, though it would be the last on the original PlayStation. This time, players took the role of a prince who must journey to discover why his father has suddenly turned mad and restore his kingdom to how it once was. The game still played much like its predecessors, though it was more open-ended due to much of the adventure taking place above ground. There were still instances of descending into dungeons, but the sheer scale of the game delighted critics of the time. Unfortunately, while there were small improvements to this third title, the game was still incredibly slow to play, both when traveling and fighting, with some complaining that a single skirmish could take up to 5 minutes. It's a solid entry, but it also makes sense that the series wouldn't continue until the PlayStation 2. The next RPG would be decidedly different, as it was an adaptation of a popular manga from the late 70s that went into wider distribution in the 80s before getting an animated film in 1994, Papo Croy. Sony would be the ones to publish the RPG developed by Epyx, who was otherwise known for the PS1 puzzle game Intelligent Cube. The game, Papo Croy's story, would actually predate the anime by 2 years and tells the tale of Pietro, Prince of Papo Croy, who learns on his 10th birthday that his mother, long thought dead, is instead in a coma. Now he must journey to the underworld alongside an apprentice witch to save his mother's soul. The gameplay features random battles which then take place on a turn-based board. It's incredibly simple and likely aimed at a younger demographic. While this game was never localized, the PSP remake did eventually come out in the West. It was only 2 weeks later, in late July, that Tecmo's Deception: Invitation to Darkness was released. Rather than a traditional RPG, players took the role of the eldest prince of a fantasy kingdom who is falsely accused by his brother of killing his father before being sentenced to death. Enraged at the betrayal and the people who did not believe him, he wishes for the power to get revenge on the world. In response, a demon grants him the power over the Castle of the Damned. With this, he is able to exact revenge on the people who visit the castle in the hopes of eventually making a pact with Satan. As each visitor arrives, he's provided a 2D view of the castle where he can place traps or expand the number of rooms as he sees fit. However, the player must manually activate the traps from the first-person perspective, meaning proper timing is necessary as well. It may not sound like an RPG, but there are RPG elements in the fact that MP is used to don different masks and affect visitors in different ways, and experience after each visitor is taken care of, giving the player more health and access to more traps. There's even strategy as to whether the player should kill an intruder immediately or capture them to be dealt with later, as capturing can grant more money to expand and upgrade the traps. Critics loved the sheer amount of possible endings and the wholly unique concept, though some bemoaned the inability to attack directly. The next RPG released for the PS1 was a big one, though it may not have been obvious at the time: Persona. Unlike future Persona games, the original didn't have the main character split their time between school and fighting enemies. Instead, it's much more traditional in structure, with a group of high school students investigating the sudden demon infestation overtaking their town, and their new ability to summon beings called personas in order to fight them. While cutscenes and battles would take place from a third-person perspective, exploration was done in the first person. Battles also required more planning, as the placement of your characters on a grid would change their effectiveness. There were also 2 scenarios based on the player's choice, though this second option was removed from the original English release. The game was lauded upon release, with many enjoying the contemporary setting, though some found the battle system too complex. Others claimed it to be the best PlayStation RPG yet, and wondered if the upcoming Final Fantasy VII could even dethrone it. A week later, the PS1 port of Ogre Battle March of the Black Queen was released, and there's not as much to say about this one. While the game is invariably a highlight of the strategy RPG genre and marked the directing career of Yasumi Matsuno, who would go on to direct Final Fantasy Tactics, the port itself changes little. The graphics are mostly the same and no extra content was added, though the soundtrack was remastered for a richer audio experience. The game is a classic, with 13 different endings, loads of classes to choose from, and a solid story of rebels trying to overthrow a corrupt queen. However, March of the Black Queen was never ported further, unlike its sequel Tactics Ogre, Let Us Cling Together. A month later, in late October, Konami released its second RPG for the PlayStation, Vandal Hearts. However, this was another strategy RPG, though it found ways to stand out from the burgeoning genre on the system. The story focuses on a newly formed republic that is struggling to stabilize amongst a conspiracy to weaken said government. Players take the role of a battalion searching for the ones behind this plot. Vandal Hearts also featured an isometric view and 3D arenas, while the characters remain sprites. Otherwise, the game is remarkably like Fire Emblem in that there's no exploration, and the story carries players from battle to battle with different victory conditions. There are even several different classes that serve as a rock, paper, scissors dynamic, though players can assign them as they'd like. However, there is no permadeath. Instead, the loss of a unit means the loss of money, and they'll be back in the next mission. Critics at the time enjoyed the strategy and dynamic spells of Vandal Hearts, but bemoaned the rigidity of the story and lack of exploration. Still, it was a success and even saw a sequel on the PS1. November 1996 saw the release of Ark the Lad 2, which was a direct continuation of the first game, though it shifted the perspective of the hero character. It's also a much bigger game, becoming less linear as the story progresses, thanks to the new hunter guilds which offer side quests for players to complete. The cast was also larger, which had the extra effect on combat, as now players had to choose 6 characters to take part in battle rather than the full cast. It was also possible to recruit monsters and even upgrade them to further expand the battle options. Critics enjoyed the longer quest, darker storyline, and flexible gameplay, though many also noted that the graphics were only mildly improved and many of the dungeons could feel monotonous. Despite this, many fans claim Ark the Lad 2 to be the best of the PS1 trilogy, with it becoming the 8th best-selling game of 1996 in Japan. However, of the 14 RPGs that had come out in Japan by December of 1996, only 7 came to North America before Final Fantasy VII's Japanese release: Kingsfield II and III, Beyond the Beyond, Suikoden, Deception, Persona, and Vandal Hearts. RPG fans in the West were starved for new content on the system, so perhaps it's little wonder that Wild Arms is so well remembered. While it didn't reach the same level of success as Ark the Lad in Japan, it was quite well reviewed and seen as one of the best RPGs on the PS1 in the West. What helps is its visual flair, as it was the first traditional RPG to use the 3D polygonal models, just not all the time. While the graphics during exploration used a top-down 2D aesthetic, battles were in full 3D, making for an impressive spectacle at the time. The spaghetti western aesthetic also helped it stand out from other RPGs, and there were just enough new ideas to the battle strategies to make it stand out. Western critics praised it as the best RPG on the system to date, even above Persona. But many also noted that the highly anticipated Final Fantasy VII was on the horizon. Yet there was one more RPG that was released before that Juggernaut in Japan, Shin Super Robot Wars, which came out the final week of 1996. The 7th game in the Super Robot Wars strategy RPG series, the game isn't especially well loved amongst fans despite it going for a more faithful look to the mecha anime represented rather than the previous super deformed style. However, this led to long load times which paired poorly with long, unskippable attack animations that dragged the pacing down. Importers complained of the bland campaign and lack of overall strategy. There's been a ton of Super Robot Wars games since this entry, so there's little reason to go back. It's more a footnote than anything else. But after looking over these RPGs, it's little wonder Final Fantasy VII made such a splash. While there were some that took advantage of the new 3D capabilities of the PlayStation, none fully capitalized on it until, arguably, Wild Arms. Yes, the Kingsfield trilogy offered 3D visuals, but the pacing and style of those games would always hold it back from mainstream success. Those games needed refinement and a more powerful system, which explains why FromSoft blew up with the Soul series. Otherwise, the games mainly used the extra power for opening animated cutscenes or higher fidelity sprites. They were basically enhanced versions of games that could be found on the Super Nintendo. That style can be gorgeous, and there are some all-time greats within this list, but the 3D was the big thing of this generation, and Final Fantasy VII was the first RPG to truly capitalize on that. Add in a memorable cast, a simple but customizable battle system, FMVs that wowed the industry, and a world that captured their imagination, and it's little wonder that RPGs garnered far more attention after this release. But which of these games stood out to you? Was Final Fantasy VII your first RPG as well? Let us know in the comments, and thank you for joining me on this trip down memory lane as many of us look forward to the upcoming Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to Good Vibes Gaming, hitting the like button, and ringing that bell. We also have a Patreon at patreon.com/gvgaming with plenty of extra perks. Until next time, bye!